Welcome back to part 2 of things that you shouldn't have been reading in high school because you didn't understand them. Lord of the Flies is a work that I actually really enjoy. Not that it's, like, a great work. Kinda is, but what I really enjoy most about Lord of the Flies is the fact that it's extremely literal, and yet is wonderful allegory at the same time. Because on one hand, it's literally a story about a bunch of boys being stuck on an island, castaway style, and devolving into cavemen, essentially. But on the other hand, it's the story of, well, it's basically Paradise Lost with a new twist on it, I guess you could say. Because the whole story is really about gluttony. That's the long and short of it. The name Lord of the Flies is a reference to Beelzebub, the demon lord of the third ring of hell in Dante's mythology, who is, again, the Lord of Gluttony. The pig's head, the other thing, the symbol of that most people relate to when they think of Lord of the Flies, is, again, another symbol of gluttony. Gluttony is usually associated with food, but that's not really the nature of gluttony as a sin. Gluttony is the opposite of temperance, which is restraint. Gluttony is anything that's indulged in to excess or waste. And the concept of Lord of the Flies is that a bunch of people all show up and they indulge in their basest instincts without any restraint, and as a result, it ruins them. Now, I mentioned Paradise Lost, and this is sort of a retelling of Paradise Lost with a different spin on it, I guess. Paradise Lost, again, is a medieval work that's about the fall from grace, and its retelling is Lucifer is basically the misunderstood bad boy character who falls because of his own pride. And that works because the whole notion is that pride is the original sin. Lord of the Flies, however, talks about the fall as gluttony. Now, that doesn't mean they're not prideful. In fact, one of the most, I want to say, iconic lines from the book is that all the boys get together and they say, we're the best at everything because we're British. And again, that's another literal thing, while also kind of talking about the folly of the British Empire, thinking that they're the best at everything. It's also like Paradise Lost because it wants to retell a story that everyone ostensibly knows. There are lots of allegories to various characters in mythology, like Cain and Abel, or the fact that Piggy is literally the lamb. That's his whole role. He's the sacrificial lamb. He's the one who talks sense. He's the voice of innocence, and he's the one who inevitably is sacrificed as they lose their innocence. Again, literal and allegory, but the fact that he's a pig, the fact that what they're fighting against turns out to be themselves, this is all, again, a story of gluttony. It's a story of a whole bunch of people indulging in whatever fantasies they have. The main character is indulging of his fantasy of control, the concept that he can control things that are around him, whereas his rival is indulging in fantasies of power, that what matters is how strong you are and his ability to, again, exert his will on others. But the thing is, though, is that the story is about them as individuals, but also them as people. They show up on the island, they show up in paradise, essentially, as quote-unquote unspoiled children. They are, by and large, children which are allegorical for humans before the fall from grace, before the grasping of understanding. And thus, at the end of the book, when other people come and find them, they only then recognize what's happened to them. They only then recognized, while being exposed to the outside world, after having that quote-unquote apple of knowledge, what has become of them. One of the things that I enjoy, and I don't think went over, at least when I was in high school, was the way in which gluttony is depicted as being insidious. So, for example, the main character spends all of his time focusing on what he thinks is restraint. He spends all of his time trying to set up rules and regulations and the way in which characters are going to interact. He thinks he's being the cause of moderation, when in reality, he's just as gluttonous as everyone else. He's just gluttonous for something else, which is why he fails, because he's so desperate to keep clinging on to something that doesn't exist. That's where he talks with the beast, and why his conversation is about the fact that The beast was him all along. It was inside of him. He couldn't kill it. It's not a thing you can kill any more than you can kill yourself. Well, you can do that, but what I mean is you can't kill the urges inside of yourself, is what I'm getting at. You can't kill your idea of yourself. Who you are and what you need is not a thing. It's not a dragon you can fight. And so he doesn't realize this until the end when he's seeing everything fall apart, that his desperation, his own need to indulge in this over-controlling only resulted in other people rebelling against it. At the same time, this is contrasted with the other boys who are bigger and stronger and who are indulging in a completely opposite sense of what gluttony is, in the fact that they are just completely unrestrained. They are completely without any moderation at all. They're just doing whatever they want, whenever they want, to basically as much as they want. There's no restraint, there's no thoughts put into anything. It is completely without any temperance whatsoever. And again, this is all very much about the inner fallibility of man, very much, alluding to Paradise Lost and all these other things. But I think on some level it's very literal. We often think of boys as being cruder and less capable, which is why it's a little weird that they tried to remake it with women. It's not that it's bad, it's just that, I don't know if it works as well. It probably would work just as well, but you kind of have to remember that it's about gluttony, and if you don't realize that the story is about our innate inability to recognize why gluttony is dangerous and why not having temperance is bad, then you're not going to be able to retell the story very well. Which I think is an interesting thing that a lot of people never point out. They either focus too much on how literal it is, or they're focusing too much on historical context. And they don't really focus on the fact that, again, it's a story about gluttony, why gluttony is a sin, why it's dangerous, and how it can pervert us without us realizing it, because we don't even realize that we're being intemperate even while we're doing it. It's not until it has disastrous results that we realize how far we've gotten. And on some level, I think it's also about kind of the innate, our innate ability to be excessive without realizing it, that we are naturally drawn to various extremes without ever really thinking of them as being extremes. That's one of the things that makes Ralph's character interesting, is that he's such an extremist that he doesn't realize it. He thinks he's not being extreme, and yet he doesn't bother to do things in such a way that are going to avoid causing backlash. He sets things up and basically says that this is how they're going to work, and he never really realizes that he's essentially just telling other people what should happen. He never really reckons with this until it all falls apart. And on some level, that's a critique of I guess this is a critique of Christianity in general. It might be a critique of more the stories of, God laying down rules without explaining them and being you need to do this, and it's not clear why until everything falls apart for the people who don't listen. And honestly, it's a little heavy-handed, I think. I think that Lord of the Flies is pretty heavy-handed, but I think that that's almost to its benefit, because I think if it was any less heavy-handed, you probably wouldn't understand all the things it's trying to say, which sounds really generic, but the fact of the matter is that, again, trying to discuss it just as the innate fallibility of man, or the fact that it's a critique of British exceptionalism, or that's a critique of, male, or boyhood, or our ideas of masculinity. These are all valid, but it's much more literally a story of gluttony. It's much more a story of why temperance is important. It's a story of why it's important for us as human beings to practice moderation, is the best way to put it. And you don't get that when you read it in high school, because it's really not the kind of deep like talking that you're going to get in high school, and also high schools don't like to talk about demons, despite the fact that literally the name of the book is the name of a title of a demon of Gluttony, and that it's, the pig's head is literally a reference to Gluttony, and the whole book is about it. And you're not going to get that because they won't talk about that kind of thing in high school, which is fine, but you're also a teenager in high school, and honestly, this is not a story that was ever intended, I think, to be read by high schoolers who are not going to understand it. Much in the same way that Orwell's work are not made for high schoolers. But yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. I just got on thinking about this because in my last episode I talked about the manga, Beelzebub, and that got me thinking about Lord of the Flies and the fact that so many people don't really understand the main thrust of the work, which isn't really their fault. The last time they read it was, in high school probably. And yeah, that's really it. That's all I wanted to talk about. So see y'all later.